Jewish historian of note and a renowned educator with an obvious passion for Jewish history and comparative religion. Charles is a very sought-after speaker and continues to inspire people with his captivating and thought-provoking talks. We must not forget, of course, that Charles is actually a dentist in the little spare time he may have. With no further ado, please give a warm welcome to Dr. Charles Landau.
And good evening to everyone. I would like to say how honoured I am to be here in Yerushalayim for Aleh. I, interestingly enough, are one of those children that in my very early life was disabled. And due to the dedication and acknowledgement of my particular condition in my very early life, I am now as well as anybody could be. Therefore, I want to acknowledge and thank and recognise the enormous work that Aleh does. It truly is producing miracles day in and day out. I want to also thank Lirit. I would be lost without emailing you every single minute of every single day. I can't sleep at night without getting an email from you. I want to thank as well Sally Ann and Dov. Tonight, the subject is Hungary. The film we'll be seeing is entitled 1945. The Jews in Hungary lived there probably from the 3rd century. And they lived all the way through, and all Hungarians will say that the Jews have been there for at least 1,000 years. And their history in the medieval period is similar and much alike to that of Jews in the other European countries. It's a history of that in Christendom in Europe, of expulsions and persecution and blood libels and ritual murder charges, and all that went to make our life relatively miserable. However, from the 18th century, along with the rest of Europe, Hungary began to move in a world which saw great light and great hope for the Jews. They were moved towards enlightenment and emancipation, assimilation and acculturation. So that by the 19th century, the Jewish population increased and they were integrated into nearly every sphere of Hungarian life and society, medicine, scientific and economic life. 1867 was a defining year. It was a year in which the Jewish population increased and kept on increasing, and was the beginning of the integration of all areas of that life as the Austro-Hungarian Empire was formed. They said, the Jews of the time in 1867, we are totally Hungarian, not only in feelings, but also in language. And as the 19th century closed, they felt Magyar, patriotic, nationalistic, beyond that of any other European country. The Jews were involved in literature and music and arts. They were industrialists. They were involved in the government and even the army. And one of the unfortunate aspects of life in those days, tens of hundreds also converted to Christianity. In the 1910 census in Hungary, there were up to 900,000 Jews in the Hungary of those days prior to the First World War. In Budapest, there are around 203,000 Jews, which represented 23% of the population. In a town such as Munkacs, they represented just under 8,000 Jews, represented some 44% of the population. And that is why, with such success, with such integration, with such assimilation into the culture of Hungary, when Zionism was literally born, with Landau and Herzl being born here, there was little attraction and little desire for Zionism. It was a classic love affair. The Jews loved Hungary as Jews loved Germany. But the end of the 19th century also saw the introduction into the lexicon of a word that had not existed before, and that was the word anti-Semitism. For if anti-Judaism had existed, anti-Semitism was a new word, and the type of anti-Semitism at the end of the 19th century was racial anti-Semitism, something not so easy to escape from. The First World War came, and if you as a Jew want to prove your patriotic status in any country, you fight for the country. Not only do you fight for the country, but you die for the country. And 10,000 Jews died fighting for Hungary. But the war, the First World War, was a disaster for Hungary. As it was a disaster for Germany, so too to its ally Hungary. For Hungary was torn apart by the Treaty of Trianon, which was the offshoot of Versailles. And in 1920, Hungary lost some 72% of its territory. They lost 3.5 million of its citizens to countries surrounding it, and they lost 5 of their major cities to the countries round about. And along with that, 1920 saw that Hungary was the first country to introduce a numerous clauses, a restriction on the number of Jews who could go to university. The tragedy, quoting, "The tragedy of Hungarian Jews was that the great majority completely identified with Magyardom, not only in political outlook, but also socially and culturally and emotionally in the deepest and fullest sense. And with a move of anti-Semitism, with a restriction on Jews in universities, schools and businesses, with awareness of the growing anti-Semitism spreading like cancer through Europe, the Jewish community of Pest issued a declaration in 1920 similar to declarations made throughout Europe, including England. Said they in the Jewish community, "Our course is the inseparably intertwined course of our Jewishness and our Hungarianness. This land, the Hungarian land, is our homeland. We watered this land with our sweat and with our blood." And then World War II approached and encroached on Hungarian Jews. The Jews were forced to recognize that they had been living in a fool's paradise, that it was, as Gershom Scholem said, a one-way love affair. They were indeed strangers, unwanted, and often hated aliens. And in 1933, Hungary, Chalashing, probably not the word they would have used, Chalashing, to get back the land they had lost, allied themselves with Germany because Germany promised that if they would stand by Germany, they would get back much of that 72% of the lands they had lost. And the Jews thought themselves safe. They were Hungarians, after all, and the Hungarian leadership would not do anything which would affect the lives of Jews, even if it was a bit rough. In 1938, Hungary introduced anti-Jewish laws, but the Jews said, it couldn't get worse. We understand this. After all, many of these excesses are against the Eastern European Jews, and they're not really Hungarian, are they? And the Hungarian Jews felt safe. And 40,000 men, the cream of Jewish society based on their age, were taken away to Hungarian labor battalions, vicious, virulent, nasty, sadistic, anti-Semitic labor battalions who used Jews as cannon fodder and used them to remove mines with their hands, and of those 40,000, hardly any returned. But it meant there were few Jewish men in the communities. In 1943, Hungary actually refused to deal with its Jews as Nazi Germany wanted, and Hungarian Jews felt safe. Then World War II changed. Germany was defeated at Stalingrad. Germany was pushed back at Leningrad. Russian troops were in Poland. Berlin was being bombed. And then Italy, in October, changed sides. And Hungary wobbled, weakened, and wavered, and considered also changing sides at that moment, that they made appeals towards the Allies. Hitler could not allow that a country defending the eastern flank, that against Russia, could possibly turn sides. And thus, on the 12th of March of 1944, Adolf Hitler ordered that on the 19th of March in Operation Margareta, they would invade Hungary. And along with invasion came Eichmann and Wiesenmeier and Becker and others of Section 4B4 of the final solution. It was the last community in Europe to suffer under the Nazi heel. It was the fastest destruction of any Jewish community in the world. Nearly half of the Jews murdered in Auschwitz came from Hungary. Between May the 15th and this week, exactly 75 years ago, our Hungarian brothers and sisters were being pushed together in order to board trains 75 years ago. And between May the 15th and July the 9th, 1944, around 437,000 Jews were murdered in Auschwitz, in particular adapted in order to receive Hungarian Jews to murder them as quickly as possible without all the paraphernalia of selections. In 8 weeks, in 56 days, at 12,000 Jews a day were murdered, up to that 437,000. Churchill, writing in Hansard, on June the 26th of that year, stated, "There is no doubt that this, the murder of Hungarian Jewry, is the greatest and the most horrible crime ever committed in the whole history of the world." And even when Eichmann retreated and the Nazis withdrew, they then came back again. In December of 1944 and January of 1945, the Arrow Cross, the nasty, pernicious, mainly youth actually, in Budapest, murdered some 20,000 Jews, many almost, at the Danube River. Then, the 8th of May, 1945, and the war in Europe ended. The world celebrated, but the Jews couldn't celebrate. There was no celebration, but hopelessness, desperation, despondency. Most of European Jews had been murdered. For most of the family, or most of the survivors, there was no family, no friends, no homes, no possessions, no country. So what do? Do you go back to that land which is steeped in Jewish blood? Do you return to the only home you know, because that's the land you can speak? Would you go elsewhere? And many did attempt to go home, to return to those lands from whence they came, to their neighbors, the Ukrainians, Latvians, Lithuanians, Poles, Czechs, and others nationalities and Nazi collaborators. A survivor of Kaunas said, "Where am I going to go? Do I want to go back to a land which is soaked in Jewish blood?" And what of those Jews who did want to return to their homes, who felt they had a right to go back from whence they came? They had a right to their homes from which they'd been kicked out. Leon Feldhandler, who was a leader and a survivor of the Sobibor revolt, was murdered by Poles. 350 Jews were murdered on returning to other places such as Łódź, Krakow, Sosnowiec, Lublin, Radom, and also in Hungary. Jews were dragged from cars, from horses, from trucks, from the road, from trains, shot and murdered for daring to return to their homes, culminating in kills in July of 1946, of course, where there was a blood libel and 42 Jews were put to death. But what are the locals? What are the people who were in the countries to which you attempted to return? What about the Hungarians, as we'll see in the film? What about their friends who lived with them and ate with them and smoked with them and went to the cinema with them and loved with them? What about them? What are their colleagues and their neighbours? Some were collaborators, some were willing executioners, and most were simply bystanders. Those who now lived in their homes, ate on their plates, ate at their tables, occupied their farms, and drove their wagons, who lived in fear of their return, their claims, their retribution, their knock on the door. As one said, where did they come from, these Jews? I never knew so many of them survived. The film, 1945, is incredibly powerful. It is about two Jews returning. Two Jews in the whole film who essentially say nothing. They say nothing throughout the film. They are the physical representation of the conscience of the Hungarian village. They slip in and out of the film as conscience comes to them. They walk, and they walk, and they walk, as you will see. Whilst the village implodes, they fight amongst themselves. Fear grips them, and paranoia enshrouds. Ladies and gentlemen, the film 1945.